Welcome, everyone. My name is Jill Jonathan, and I'm with Red, Wine, and Blue. We are a community of women who use digital media and friend-to-friend organizing to change the world one suburb at a time. We are so glad you're joining us for this very important conversation with Shannon Watts, our special guest. Hi, Joe. Hi, Rachel. And a special welcome to Shannon Watts. So we are so excited that you're here. And we really are going to start the focus of the conversation about the power of moms. So, Joe, Rachel, do you want to say hi? And then we'll go in and we'll get started with Shannon.
Hi.
Hi, I am like live from a very suburban mom furniture shopping. So,
yes, we can all relate to that. So, Shannon, thank you so much for joining us. I just have to fangirl for a second. I'm a huge fan. I have your book, Fight Like a Mother.
Same.
I have a Moms Demand Action magnet on my car.
Yay.
So yeah, we're just really excited for you to join us. And you know, at Red, Wine, and Blue, we're a powerful group of women. And I know that's, you recognized the power of moms, and that's what really got you to start Moms for Demand Action. So could you just tell us a little bit about the power of moms and what that means to you?
Yeah, I certainly never imagined I would be an activist. I was taking a 5-year break from my career to blend my family with my husband's family. So I have 3 kids and he has 2. And I just thought, okay, I'll go back to the work at the end of this 5-year period. And that's exactly what I was doing when I was folding laundry in my home at the time in Indiana and saw breaking news that there was an active shooter at a school in Newtown, Connecticut. And like everyone here, I'm sure, I was just devastated to watch this news unfold. And it's still unfathomable to me a decade later that 20 children and 6 educators were slaughtered in the sanctity of an American elementary school. And I went to bed that night in tears, but I woke up enraged. I was so angry that this had happened, and I saw Congress do absolutely nothing when Gabby Giffords, one of their own colleagues, was shot. So I knew it was going to be up to activists to demand change. I went online. I tried to find an organization like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, but for the issue of gun safety. And I really found mostly think tanks run by men, some one-off city and state organizations, again, mostly run by men. I wanted to be part of a badass army of women. And I started a Facebook page, not thinking it would be an organization, just thinking it was going to be an online conversation about the need for women and mothers to band together against this powerful, wealthy special interest. And Type A Women turned it into the largest offline grassroots movement in the country. 10 years later, we are now twice as large as the NRA with 10 million supporters. And we're making significant, miraculous headway in just a decade. And I think that is a great illustration of the power of moms.
Yeah. Hi, Shannon. It's Joe from Jersey. You can call me Joe. Nobody really calls me Joe. I just wanted to say hi, and what an honor it is to talk to you. You are an absolute inspiration, and like the founder of Red, Wine, and Blue, you prove every day what women can do, how we can change the world. Mother Jones, I believe, described Moms Demand as the women that are the NRA's worst nightmare.
Yep.
That's the greatest compliment ever. So I guess, one of the questions, I have so many questions. One of the questions I personally have, because I hear this argument in my little red corner of New Jersey a lot, is this myth that arming teachers, I have a almost 10-year-old and a 13-year-old, and they say that we should arm the teachers in these schools, and that will keep our kids safer. And I would just love to have your take on that idea.
Yeah, it's asinine. It's important to remember that police who are highly trained who are armed and who hit a moving target about 30% of the time, give or take, according to research and data. That we are going to turn everyday teachers into sharpshooters is absurd, and it is not what teachers want. You don't take on a love of fostering knowledge in children and teens because you want to have to shoot armed intruders, or at least if that's what you do want to do, you're probably not cut out for the profession of teaching. I have a daughter in Indiana who is a preschool teacher, underwent lockdown drills her whole life, and now as a teacher has to endure lockdown drills where she puts babies and toddlers in a crib and rolls them out the door and runs down the street. That's the plan for protecting our most precious and most vulnerable humans from people who have guns. We can prevent school shootings by keeping guns out of schools in the first place. We know most school shooters are students who have easy access to unsecured guns in their homes. So just by keeping guns locked, unloaded, and separate from ammunition, we would go a long way in protecting our schools. This idea of arming teachers, you arm millions of teachers, you're certainly going to make money for gun makers, right? Because you're selling more guns, and you're encouraging the idea that we need guns for anyone, anywhere, anytime, no questions asked, and you're inculcating an entire new generation to being gun buyers. You're doing that, but you're not actually making anyone safer.
Right. Right. Just to touch on that, when you talked about lockdowns, I worked in education for a number of years and saw them from the inside. But I've also, experienced my children sharing their stories. And something that I'm struck by, I was listening to Fred Guttenberg talk this morning on MSNBC about, the reality that today's youth have with these lockdown drills and school shootings and just mass shootings in general, that it wasn't really a part of my reality. I'm 48. So, I mean, it's really it's unbelievable to me that that's something that these young people have had to grow up to think of as normal. But I think that's shaped a lot of their advocacy and their activism. How do you feel about that?
I have very strong opinions about lockdown drills. A lot of what we're talking about just keeps coming back to money, right? So we were talking about arming teachers. School safety is a $1 billion industry. So people are making money off of these drills. And these schools, 90% of school districts are doing these drills, and they need to feel like they're getting their money's worth. So what are these drill companies doing? Well, it's not evidence-based data. It's not trauma-informed. They're doing things like simulating gun violence and hiring strangers to come in and pretend they're active shooters. They're springing these drills on teachers and students without letting them know they're going to happen. In Indiana, they even have fired rubber bullets at teachers so they, quote, feel the adrenaline of an active shooting, unquote. It's perverted. It's traumatizing. There's very little data that shows that these drills actually prevent mass shootings or school shootings. There is data that shows they cause sleeplessness, worsening school performance, anxiety, not just among students, but among educators as well. I have 5 kids. If I had it to do all over again, they're adults now, I would not let any of them go through active shooter drills. I don't think that we need to add another layer of trauma to our kids, given everything else that's going on in the world. However, as I said, so many schools are doing them, and we put guidelines that we think schools should follow on everytown.org. You can find our shooting drill report there. But basically, these should never be a surprise. They should always be announced in advance. You should have the opportunity to opt out if you want to. They should never simulate gun violence, and they should be trauma informed. And so that is just not happening enough right now in this country.
Hi, Shannon, it's Rachel. I have a question. I'm also a huge fan, by the way.
Thank you.
But I've already learned a lot of, fun little tidbits in your answers to these couple of questions. And Is there a place, a resource where we can go and kind of, sort of read up on this before the next time we're hanging out with our friends or at a dinner
Yeah.
party? Because I think these are very punchy, and I think it's a great way to have a conversation. I mean, here at Red Wine and Blue, we're always talking about the power of, peer-to-peer, sort of discussions and conversations, and how, and we know obviously that people um, get more out of a personal conversation with someone that they, with whom they have rapport
Yeah.
and trust. So I think, talking about, I mean, I was not aware that the lockdown industry is a $1 billion industry. I mean, I think it's intuitive that it's not evidence-based, but just I think anyone can look at something and see that it's a $1 billion industry, and it has so far really saved no lives as far as I can
Yep.
tell. So, but other
Yeah.
facts like that, where can we get that?
Yeah.
Because I want people to have them.
Well, so
I'm really fun at dinner parties, by the way.
yeah, exactly. This will make you even more popular. I had people, and by that I mean mostly women, come up to me at all of these events that I was speaking at, and they would always say, I want to understand how you did this. I'm really passionate about a completely different issue or this issue, and I want to do something in my community or my state, whatever it was. And it just became clear to me by 2018, after I'd been doing this for 5 years, that I needed to put this all down in a book, especially before I finished menopause, because I was not remembering anything. And so I wrote a book called Fight Like a Mother. And a lot of these stories and this information is in that book. And then I would also say, if you are a volunteer with Moms to in Action, you can, we train our volunteers to be able to have these conversations all the time with policymakers and with legislators and even with business leaders. And so you can go to momsdemandaction.org. There's a lot of information there. And also, something that is sort of tangentially related to this issue, which is secure storage, which we touched on, this idea of keeping guns locked, unloaded, and separate from ammunition. I highly recommend that people go to the website besmartforkids.org. And you can find all the information there, not just on how to securely store your firearms, but how to ask friends and family members if they're gun owners and if their guns are securely stored. I can't tell you how many volunteers have said to me in the last decade, I just was practicing on my mother-in-law and I found out she keeps a loaded gun in a shoebox under the bed where my kid sleeps when they stay at her house.
Oh, dear
So
God.
ask the question. 4.6 million children in this country live in homes with unsecured guns.
Mm-hmm. Or, I mean, there was an incident in Virginia in the beginning of the first week of January where a 6-year-old shot his teacher, and the gun apparently had a trigger lock that was no match for a 6-year-old. I mean, I assumed that the trigger lock was not activated, but stranger things have happened. I mean, I'm furniture shopping with my 12-year-old now, who has left no item untouched in my 28 stores in 2 days. So, but I do think that it's these are difficult conversations to have with in-laws, with when your child's going to go even spend the night with your friends. These are difficult conversations to have. You will regret it if you don't have the conversation. And so you just have to do it. But I understand it's out of people's comfort zone, because it's out of my comfort zone too. Yeah. I've been there. And without giving specifics, it's been very awkward for me. And my husband and I have had to navigate this, but
and I think the way I look at it, and the way that I started doing it after learning about this, after starting Moms to in Action, because I didn't do it before that, was that it's like a laundry list of things that you ask. And I did ask, do you have a pool and is there a gate around it?
That's
I did ask
too. It's just
I did say, like, my kids can't play M-rated video games. Some of my kids can't be around peanuts. And you just add to that, if you have guns, how are they stored? And if someone doesn't want to answer that question, or they're defensive about answering that question, then maybe the play date should be at your house.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. When I first had my son, and again, he's 13 now, a family member, she was very, she was very eager to offer lots of advice, and I was very eager to accept all sorts of advice. And as he got older, she continued to do that. And one of the pieces of advice that she offered me was to make sure that I asked that question of anybody who he went to a play date at their house. And I did, of course, after that, start asking that question, only to then learn later, years later, after we'd been going to her house all those years, that I hadn't asked her that question. And she revealed to me that they had two guns in the house, and I had never thought to reveal that to me before. And my kids had both been there. So I guess it's like to Rachel's point that, even with the family members where you think like, I don't need to necessarily ask this question, you actually, you might want to ask that question. Because
and to be clear, I'm not saying that if someone is a gun owner, you shouldn't send your kids to their homes. I mean, there are 400 million guns in this country. But if they keep a loaded gun at the top of their closet, that is not secure storage.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's an eyes wide open sort of situation.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't know, maybe you ask the question and they re-examine some of their behaviors as well.
Yeah.
I mean, it's we have to kind of step out on faith in that way. But thank you. I really appreciate the answer about how we can, casually bring up these facts and figures, maybe to policy members, maybe to our friends. I mean, I think so much of this stuff, we talk about this a lot, I mean, so much of this stuff can be overwhelming. So much of it can be, and there can be some timidity there. But, once we get, you're right, an army of moms, and we're just getting more people to realize this can be part of it doesn't have to be everything we do. It doesn't have to be our entire identity, but it's part of who we are. It's part of the activism, that we participate in. And it's very easy to add to your life in a meaningful way and make a difference.
Well, and I realize that this is very intense, but this is the truth. I can't tell you how many survivors I've worked with whose children were the victims of an unintentional shooting who said, I just wished I had asked the question.
Mm. Mm.
Yeah.
Shannon, on the conversation perspective here, because these conversations are things that we need to be having, and we need to sort of have, the tools to navigate the questions that we might get. One of the questions that I think there's a lot of misconception around is this idea that gun reform advocates are coming for all your guns. You said that yourself. Like, you said I'm not anti-gun in the past, and it's true, and it's an interesting distinction, I think, because there is such a heavy reliance on this argument that anyone who wants common sense gun reform is coming for all your guns. So, for us to have those conversations, what are some points that you can offer to anybody listening so they can engage in that conversation?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's so many different straw men, and you asked me about where this information is stored. There's an entire chapter in my book about fallacies that come up over and over again and how you should respond to them. But certainly this idea that we want to confiscate guns or undo the Second Amendment is a common theme. I am the granddaughter and the daughter of gun owners. Many of our volunteers are gun owners, or their partners are gun owners. Again, there are 400 million guns in this country. There are other peer nations with high rates of gun ownership, and yet they have low rates of gun violence. We have 400 million guns, too few gun laws, and as a result, we have a 26 times higher gun homicide rate than any other high-income country. That's because there is such incredibly easy access to guns, and really, the gun lobby and gun makers have stripped the responsibilities that should and used to go along with gun rights. And gun extremists have really been given a seat at the table to essentially write our gun policies in this country. Most gun violence in this country is carried out with handguns. It's gun homicides and gun suicides, domestic gun violence too. And so the policies that we're talking about have never been about confiscation. They have always been about reinstalling the guardrails to make sure people who are a danger to themselves or others don't have easy access to guns.
And Shannon, I have a question to kind of pivot just a little bit. Here we are four white women talking about this. And, I was talking to a friend who's a woman of color about the fear I have of my kids going to school and an active shooter. And she said, yeah, I have that fear too. She said, but also I have a son who has brown skin. And so I have a different kind of fear of related to guns. So I'm just curious, like, what your thoughts are of guns and how that relates to communities of color and
Mm.
how that plays a role in it, and something that we don't always talk about.
Yeah, so I was a white suburban mom who got involved in this issue because I was afraid my kids weren't safe in their schools. Shame on me for sitting on the sidelines while the communities of my Black and brown sisters were decimated by this crisis for decades. Um, we all come to this issue for different reasons, but when you come to the issue, and I think this is the important role that white women play, like, we need to be doing the work. And it isn't just about school shootings and mass shootings, which are about 1% of the gun violence in this country. And that doesn't make them any less horrific or senseless or preventable. But we need to be also looking at the gun violence that is impacting day-to-day lives in America, killing over 110 people, wounding hundreds more. And that is, in particular, gun violence in urban communities. And so the solutions for that gun violence isn't the same as what will stop a school shooting. And we have to be dedicated to fixing it all. It's complex, and it demands holistic solutions, looking at the whole crisis. So, for example, our organization has unlocked hundreds of millions of dollars for community violence intervention programs in the last decade. That work that's being done by local organizations to intervene in retaliatory gun violence before it occurs is shown by data to be incredibly effective. And during COVID, as you can imagine, those relationships were ruptured because people were in their homes, or they only were able to have relationships via, their computer or their phone. And so more than ever, we need to make sure we are providing funding for those programs. We need to be lifting up the work of mothers groups, particularly Black moms, who have stood in the street and used their bodies to stop bullets so that people would not shoot at each other. And we also have to pay attention to suicide. Suicide is gun violence. Police violence is gun violence. We just have to look at this big picture. And, Jessica Valenti, the feminist author, talks a lot about the value that white women bring to activism, which is that because of our privilege, we think the system works. And so we know how to work the system, right? White women can get you a permit in 24 hours if you want to hold an event, because they know how to work the system. And so we have to be dedicated to using our voices and our votes on this issue, and not just how it impacts us and speaks directly to our own very specific privileged fears, but as it is impacting all women and families.
You said in your book, Fight Like a Mother, you understand that it's part of your role to make the world a better place for everyone. So just like what you just said, it's a moral obligation that you feel not so much as a duty, but as a simple fact of life. That really just echoes what you just said. And it's so important and it's so powerful. I think that that's something that so many people are both inspired by and maybe don't realize.
Yeah, Alice Walker has a quote, which is that activism is the rent I pay to live on the planet. And I say this as someone who was not an activist until I was in my 40s. But when we ask our volunteers, and I've been a full-time volunteer now for a decade, what makes you not just come to the work, but stay? Staying is the key, because it's easy to sign up for something, but to get people to stay involved for years, that's a whole new issue, right? That's miraculous. And we know two things drive our volunteers. One is that they feel we're winning. So even if someone listening to this conversation who sees a mass shooting or sees a bad piece of legislation passed and says something cynical like, this is hopeless, nothing's changing, If you are actually on the ground doing the work, you know nothing could be further from the truth. There has been a seismic shift in American politics on this issue, from the fact that 25% of all Democrats in Congress had an A rating in the NRA, from the NRA, those Democrats in Congress just 10 years ago. And today, not one does. Not a single Democrat in Congress has an A rating from the NRA. And they proudly wear that F rating as a pin on their lapel. And we got 15 Republicans to sign on to the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act last summer. That on top of the fact that we have a 90% track record of stopping the NRA's agenda every year for the last 7 years in state houses. And we've passed hundreds of good gun bills. And I could go on and on and on. If you're on the ground, you know we're winning. And that what we've done in the last decade is astounding. But the other reason that they stay as volunteers is that they find their community. And I think that's because, look, this is a dark issue. It can get really depressing. It can feel hopeless. But we insist on joy and community in our activism. People do not want to stay involved unless they find their people and they feel a sense of hope, which there's an activist who says hope is a discipline, and that's exactly right. You have to train yourself to be hopeful. And you celebrate together, right? That's what builds a community and keeps people involved. And I think we forget that piece of this work sometimes.
Shannon, I really appreciate you pointing that out, celebrating the wins and having the community. And what are some ways that you all do that with your group? Like as women, we talk about self-care and the need for self-care and compassion fatigue, which is something I suffer from often because I care so much. So I have to have some boundaries around that. What are some ways that you do that in your work?
Yeah, so I say that this and any activism, right, because of the way the system is set up, it's set up for incremental change. Now, I've seen that lead to revolutions, but it can be very frustrating. So if this is a marathon, not a sprint, it's also a relay race. And you have to be able to hand the baton to other people when you need to prioritize yourself or your family. There have been many times along the way I've needed to do that. I wrote about in my book the fact that I have a kid who has a very severe eating disorder. It's not the recovery is not linear. There have been times I've been on my way to the airport for a mom's event and I've had to turn around and go home because I had to prioritize my kids' care. And I think because I'm a woman, I feel guilty about giving other people my work, or I feel worried about my identity. Like, who am I without this work? And what happens if it goes away? And what I learned every time I've stepped back is that the work doesn't go away. It's still there when you come back, and other people have brought energy and new ideas to it, and they're ready to hand the baton back to you. And so whatever that looks like for you, whatever is healing for you, whatever self-care looks like, I know it can be different for everyone. For me, it is right now different than it was a year ago. I'm really into weightlifting, and that gives me a peace of mind. But a year ago, it might have been hiking or reading, whatever it is for you. I can't decide that. But make sure you're doing those things, because if you burn out, you're no good to yourself. You're no good to your family, and you're no good to activism. Like, you can't do any of it if you get to that point.
Yeah, we really do need to keep lifting each other up too. Like, there's so much of what you said that really hits me, because I found in Red, Wine, and Blue this community of women that made me feel like I had a home, that I wasn't alone out there, and feeling like that empowers all of us. Mm-hmm. And I think that's obviously definitely something that you've done. And it's incredible because you tweeted that never underestimate the power of a mother's love. I think that was a Mother's Day tweet, and it's so true. And it really, there's so much, we talk about this a lot. I know it sounds like something in a greeting card, but there's so much more that we have in common than that divides us. And when it comes to protecting our kids, whether that is from extremism in their school boards or from random gun violence or from, God forbid, a mass shooting. I mean, we really do have so much more that ties us together. And on this particular issue, you've talked about the fact that most Americans actually support common sense gun reform and gun legislation. And yet, how is it? I mean, I know you said that there is progress on the ground, and I think that's amazing. And it is really important that we focus on that so that people don't feel hopeless, because so often people see these shootings and they can feel like nothing is changing. And you're saying it is, and I think that's incredibly important that we highlight that more. But with what is the percentage? I thought I heard someone say 80% of Americans actually favor gun reform. Is that correct?
Yes, so it depends on whether there's been a recent shooting in the news, but it's anywhere from 80 to 90% of Americans, including Republicans and gun owners, who support common sense gun safety laws like a background check on every gun sale, which is not required right now by federal law, safety training, something called the red flag law, which allows police to temporarily remove the guns from someone who is a danger to themselves or others, disarming domestic abusers, secure storage, and on, right? These are things that the average American agrees should be in place. However, there is this group of gun extremists, and I've seen this become more insidious in the last decade, this group of extremist right-wing MAGA Republicans who believe that any law whatsoever regarding guns is an infringement on the Second Amendment. And we see this with permitless carry. This is a truly terrifying law that is now passed in 25 states. It's an NRA priority. It means you don't have to have a background check or any safety training to carry a hidden loaded handgun in public. And these laws are shown by data to increase gun violence and gun death, right? It's pretty intuitive. And yet it's these extremists, and not just extremists who are asking their lawmakers to pass these policies, but actual lawmakers who are elected who are extremists themselves. And so we have a whole program called Demand a Seat, where we are electing our volunteers and survivors to office. Hundreds and hundreds have run in the last decade. In the last election cycle in November, over 140 of our own volunteers and survivors were elected to all levels of government across the country. And I really do think, the saying goes, if you don't have a seat at the table, you're probably on the menu. And we have seen that for women in this country over and over again. And so we have to fill those tables with more and more women.
I absolutely agree. Thank you so much, Shannon, for saying that. And so I was going to ask you, as we wrap up, what is something that you're most proud of in the work that you've done? I don't know if you can just pick one thing, but I imagine that is part of it, is getting women in those seats. But yeah, I'd love to hear from you if there's one thing or some of the top things that you're just most proud of.
Yeah, I mean, that's always an easy question for me, because my dear friend Lucy McBath, a gun violence survivor, her son, Jordan Davis, a Black 17-year-old, was shot and killed at a Florida gas station by a white man who said his music was too loud. And Lucy immediately became an activist. This happened just weeks before the Sandy Hook school shooting, and we were connected soon after. And I asked her to be a spokesperson for the organization. I didn't have any money. Neither of us knew what that meant, but she agreed. And then she became an employee and was very focused on volunteer development and rallying the troops across the country. And then, we would end every conversation and I would say, like, when are you running for office? And finally, one day she said, this was after the Parkland tragedy, she said, I'm running. And she ran for Congress. She won a seat held by Republicans for 30 years. It's Newt Gingrich's old seat. And she just won her third term. And she has been a champion for gun safety legislation, as I mentioned, which passed finally this last summer, first federal legislation on gun safety to pass in 26 years in this country. So I will always be proud of my friend Lucy McBath and her role from volunteer to Congresswoman.
Yeah, that is incredible. It's just one of the many ways that you've impacted this world for the better. I'm going to let Jill wrap up in a second, but I will fangirl for one final time. Thank you so much. Rachel lost her connection, unfortunately, but she asked me to thank you as well and to say
Of course.
it was nice to talk to you. But just thank you so much for joining us, for having this conversation, for helping the people listening to have these conversations as well, because that is having the conversations is how we move the needle and change the world. So I just wanted to say that before Jill wraps. Thank you so much for all of your work.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And especially thank you for recognizing the power of moms. I mean, just to tie it back into that, I think sometimes as moms, we feel like, or women in general, like we just don't recognize our power. But I just want everybody to know that we all have it and we all have a voice, and it's really important. So I think with the work that you do, Shannon, lifting up the voices of women. And then we do that as well with Red, Wine, and Blue. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Please definitely follow Shannon Watts, follow Moms Demand Action, follow us at Red, Wine, and Blue. We'll keep you in the know, and we'll keep you inspired to keep going, and we'll give you permission to take those breaks when you need them. So remember to rest. So thank you, ladies. I really appreciate your time, and have a great afternoon, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Shannon.
Thank you.